Hello there ladies and gentlemen, TX141 here, also known as Paul, welcoming you to a brand new trio of Ace in a Day gameplays for the arcade mode of War Thunder. In today's episode we shall be reviewing the highly requested Focke-Wulf TA-152 H-1, a German high altitude fighter aircraft coming at a battle rating of 6.3 and a tier of 4. To provide you with a brief historical overview of the plane in general and the variant depicted here today, we must roll back to 1940 and consider the fact that the German Luftwaffe was already starting to consider, on a serious level, the need for raising the effective combat ceilings of their fighter aircraft. This was well before the arrival, we should note, of high altitude bomber types such as the B-17 in the European theatre of operations. By the end of this year, Focke-Wulf had already started to work on 3 high altitude variants of the base Focke-Wulf 190 A1 variant, investigating the effects of injecting nitrous oxide into the BMW 801 radial engine. Firms such as DVL and HIF Motoren were already working on their own turbo superchargers. Meanwhile, Daimler-Benz and Junkers were testing their new Daimler-Benz 603 and Junkers Jumo 213 liquid-cooled radial engines respectively. And on top of this, the last 15 Focke-Wulf 190 A0 pre-production airframes were designated as the prototype testbeds for medium to high altitude developments of the Focke-Wulf 190, not just in terms of the research on the engines, but also in terms of cabin pressurization, which was crucial for high altitude aircraft. Out of the 3 prototype strains, in particular the Focke-Wulf 190B, C and D, the D, or the eventual Dora, was to see the most successful development as a medium altitude fighter, lacking a pressurized cabin, but featuring the Junkers Jumo 213A engine, between 1941 and the spring, or the early stages we should say, of 1942. Meanwhile, the B and C were blighted by a number of development issues, and specifically concerning the B, the performance during test flights was disappointing, meaning that the B in particular was scrapped rather early on. However, in the autumn of 1942, German intelligence caught wind of the development of the B-29, the eventual successor to the B-17, and this would only compound the problems that the Germans were facing with the relentless onslaught of B-17 formations in Europe. This led to a lot of the work being sped up, and in response Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt started to put forward proposals for and if I pronounce this right, a Hochleistungsjäger, or a higher altitude performance fighter, which would have a significantly higher combat ceiling and be able to double up in the interceptor and reconnaissance fighter roles. There were 2 stages in these proposals, with stage 1 being for a fighter based on already existing airframes. In particular with Focke-Wulf, the Focke-Wulf 190 RA2 and RA3 developments would be based off of the Focke-Wulf 190D. Stage 2 on the other hand was for a new, specifically designed high altitude fighter, and in the case of Focke-Wulf once again, this was known as the Focke-Wulf 190 RA4D. In particular with the RA2 and RA3, the Junkers Jumo 213 liquid-cooled radial engine would be used. A pressurized cabin would be added, and allowances for both the nitrous oxide GM1 and methanol water MW50 injections would also be provided. The fuselage was also lengthened, and these 2 aircraft were to form the basis of the TA-152, with the redesignation occurring at the end of 1942 out of respect to Kurt Tank, the chief designer of Focke-Wulf's Prestige. Meanwhile, the RA4D, which was renamed the TA-153, this was an important aircraft due to the fact of its wing capacity, or really its wing design we should say, whereby the featuring of a new, larger and enlarged wing meant that by comparison with the Focke-Wulf 190D and the potential TA-152, this was to confer greater aerodynamic, manufacturing and fuel capacity advantages. So this wing was standardised into the TA-152 forthwith. Nonetheless, Tank called for the Daimler-Benz 603 engine to be installed into the TA-152 due to the superior high altitude development or performance that this engine would confer. And so this engine was only granted for the TA-152C variant, not the H. Nonetheless, until the spring of 1944, little momentum was carried on with regards to the TA-152 project, and as we turn the page in our history book here, we realise that this was due to the backfoot nature of the German Air Force at this point, and the fact that there was a need to prioritise improving aircraft already in service. The first 2 TA-152H prototypes then were produced in June-July 1944 and were to act as the main testbeds for the eventual TA-152H-1, with the end result being the roll-off of at least over 150 H-1s from the Cottbus assembly line between December 1944 and the end of the Second World War. In general, the H-1 was to feature a 47 foot 4.5 inch or a metric 14.4 metre wingspan, a Yokosumo 213E1 liquid-cooled radial engine providing a base allowance of 1,750 horsepower, with the methanol water 50 and GM1 injections available of course, two 20mm MG151 inboard cannons mounted in the wings, and a single 30mm Mk108 motor cannon firing through the propeller hub. The most notable service of the TA-152H-1 then was in the hands of JG-301, the camouflage for the squadron which you may see on the screen today. This squad was to use the TA-152 in collaboration with Focke-Wulf 190D variants in order to provide top cover for the ME-262 bases, as the jets came into land or were starting to take off, preventing them from being bounced by the Allied fighter cover over the European theatre of operations. And so of our extensive history concerning the TA-152 now considered, let us examine how this unique fighter handles in War Thunder. Ergo, for our first game of today, we are on the airfield domination map Stalingrad Winter. For this, and all subsequent games we shall be using the following setup. Air target belts for our 20mm cannons. The reasoning here is the ratio of high explosive incendiary Minengeschoss rounds to the other rounds available in the belt. They are the armour-piercing incendiary and incendiary tracer rounds. We compile this with Omni-Purpose belts for our 30mm cannon, on the same principle. 3 high explosive incendiary tracer rounds of the Minengeschoss type to a single incendiary round. The combined effect here is the fact that the high explosive rounds will have a very good chance of ripping off fuselage components of any given target we may encounter, with the 30mm cannon shells being at their lower muzzle velocity, meaning that they need to get in close in order to be effective. But nonetheless, the 30mm cannon will rip apart any bomber we may encounter. And in a similar vein, it will either slaughter a fighter we encounter, or we can use the 20mm cannon rounds to back this up, with the emphasis here being initial destruction rather than setting our targets on fire and leaving them to burn to death. We also need the tracers here to distinguish the difference in muzzle velocities of the 20mm cannons and the 30mm cannon, whereby the 20mm have a significant advantage in this regard. Our gun convergence is the one of 500 metres due to the centralised layout of the armament, with the 20mm cannons being inboard in the wings and a propeller hub firing 30mm cannon. Finally, we are using a normalised 45-minute fuel load as it is the lowest we can take and will enable us to make it to the end of the game unscathed on fuel capacity. And so we initiate this game with a very gradual climb. We notice that at a speed of 230 km an hour, our climb rate has petered out to a major extent, especially by comparison with our first wet stage, whereby at 480 km an hour down to approximately 410, we were climbing very well and had a climb rate comparable to that of most of our battle rating contemporaries, including the Focke-Wulf 190D12, the Spitfire F Mark 14, and the Messerschmitt 109G. But at the same time, we do not have the climb rate of say an F8F-1B Bearcat, or indeed the Messerschmitt 109K4, and so we have to be wary of this. As our speed drops, especially below 300 km an hour, we'll see that our climb rate drops dramatically, and this means that there is already a speed handicap on the climb rate performance of the TA-152H-1. But now that we have positioned ourselves up at 3,900 metres altitude and obtained a speed of 435 km an hour, we see a Messerschmitt 19 trying to climb up underneath us. But here, because we have regained our speed position, we are able to outclimb the 109, or at least climb with them, and ensure that they cannot come up underneath us as we begin to come around to try and dive down on them. But here the 109 decides to dive down on friendly fighters. And whilst it would be good to engage the 109 and get them off the tail of our friendly Focke-Wulf 190, we need to be adamant in our role here. This would be a nice to have situation, but at the same time we need to be up high in order to make the most of this plane and ensure that we can provide the higher altitude suppression role and interceptor role that this plane is designed for. We know as we look around that there is nobody else up in the sky, whether they be friendly or foe alike. And so we continue to insert our presence onto the battlefield, whereby now up at 4,500 metres altitude, and noticing the Horten Ho 229 on the opposite side of the map at a slightly lower altitude, we begin to consider our options. The Ho here starts to come towards us. Whether they mean to attack us in a head-on, or just head our way, we need to come around accordingly. And we can see here by balancing ourselves out on our rudder and our elevators, we can do that very quickly with some aileron adjustment. And so, we once again see how this plane handles well with speed, with an emphasis already being in the range of 450 km an hour in order to initiate this controllability process. We notice a P-80A5 shooting star climbing up gradually but then deciding to dive into the fray. And so we turn our attentions to a Yakovlev Yak-9 UT, who is climbing up but on the verge of a stall. And so we go into a dive for the kill. Our first burst here is waylaid due to a slight jagged manoeuvre on the Yak-9 UT's part and very poor accuracy on the pilot's part here in terms of my performance. However, we straight away go up into a Immelman split S style play and come around on the Yak-9 UT as they stall out once again underneath us, not learning from the hardship of the first time, and we make it count the second time. Our initial burst rips them apart, and we only need to put in a couple more 20mm cannon rounds to finish them off. With our first kill in the bag, we now continue our momentum through to attack a B-17 Flying Fortress who has spawned in but refuses to dive down to lower altitudes, also keeping our eyes on a PE2 who may come over to intervene. We see here in a gradual dive our speed builds up rather rapidly, and so we can converge with the B-17 very quickly. And as soon as we're in 500 metres, we're able to use our 30mm cannon to great effect in order to rip them apart for our second kill. And we bank around accordingly, noticing a Messerschmitt 109 coming up underneath us, a K4 variant here, and the difference in climb rate is being exaggerated to some extent already, whereby the K4 continues to climb and we cut this very fine. We intend to go for the head-on as they begin to stall out. And now we talk about the durability of the TA-152. As we pick up our third kill here, we shall note that we only took damage from the 13mm machine guns based above the nose of the Messerschmitt 109K4, or above the engine deck. And what this essentially means is that we were able to force the 30mm cannon shells of the K4 to drop underneath us. If they had hit us anywhere on our fuselage, we would be dead. But the 13mm machine gun rounds, despite their questionable damage power, actually did some damage to our engine, piercing the oil tank but nothing more. And, according to the history behind this aircraft, the 350 pounds approximately of armour is concentrated around the main fuselage, i.e. along the main fuselage decking, in terms of its length and nature, by comparison with the wings. And this is emphasised in game, whereby there's a good portion of armour around the engine and indeed around the pilot. And so if you are going to go into those head-ons, so long as the rounds hit towards the centre of the plane, not the wings, you will be able to take some of the machine gun fire, or indeed some of the lighter cannon fire, as we saw there. Nonetheless, having knocked out another plane for our fourth kill, we press on, looking over towards a Focke-Wulf 190 trying to climb up, but at the same time continue to look around to make sure there is nothing else trying to come up after us. We note here how, by being above the enemy spawn point, we have now left our opponents with perhaps the mindset of needing to deal with us. We should also notice that a B-17 has once again decided to spawn in and refuses to dive initially, although we have to be wary of the Focke-Wulf 190 also coming up underneath us. It's a Dora type, but instead of going down directly, we instead go against this plane with the same gust as the K4, whereby we decide to go for the head-on as they begin to stall out, and this time we time it much better, forcing the D-12's 20mm and 30mm cannon fire, the same as our own, to go underneath our right wing. And at this point, having picked up our ace in a day, we loop round, and notice the B-17 and the Dornier 217 both flying level and starting to dive very gradually as we get closer and closer, as we can see by zooming in. Nonetheless, our presence is being felt here, whereby we are drawing the attentions of some of the enemy fighters, and at the same time we are forcing the enemy bombers to sacrifice their ability to level bomb. We look around and notice that our playstyle has meant that we have actually obtained ourselves a nice niche, and we have allowed our team in order to spread themselves around the rest of the map, whereby we have now captured the central airfield thanks to the fact we may have drawn some of the enemy fighters away, or at least kept their eyes on us rather than the central map. At this point we come around to notice the Messerschmitt 109 being a little bit more subtle this time in terms of their climb rate, and so we decide not to dive down but just continue to stay up high. Our engine continues to be durable here, and what we should note in terms of the durability is that if the engine does take one or two hits, it is not the end of the world. The engine will react rather well to even taking a 20mm cannon shell to it, whereby it will last long enough for you to make it back to the airfield accordingly, or even finish the game for an extent. We begin to dive down rather gradually on the Messerschmitt 109, who goes into their own dive. And so here, whilst we make our intentions clear, we go for the Messerschmitt 109. Our actual intention here is to go for the Spitfire, who has landed and is therefore vulnerable for a kill. Whereby, despite the fact that they are on the airfield, any plane that can take off once again is a threat. And so, we go in for our sixth, and what will be our final kill for this game. Opening fire at approximately a kilometre, our rounds begin to hit at 700 metres and we begin to fly off with our 6th kill in the bag. At this point, as we go into a gentle climb, we emphasise how this plane retains its ability to climb very well in a linear fashion out of a boom and zoom style dive, whereby, having started off at approximately 700 metres altitude in initiating our climb, we're already at approximately 1700 with a speed of 530 km an hour left after our initial build-up speed of 750 km an hour. And so, we shall now take a look at the post-game stats. As a result, we can see that our 6 kills allowed us to obtain 19,430 silver lines. On top of this, we accreted 1,834 research points, all going towards our continued efforts on the Horton Ho 229v3. We hereby conclude this first game as a valid demonstration of the ideal role for the TA-152 H-1, whereby if it is given the opportunity to climb off to the side of the map and in a stealthy fashion, it may be able to get to approximately 4,000 metres altitude in an airfield domination or air domination game, or 5,500 metres altitude onwards in a ground strike game, and be able to rain down terror from the higher altitude regions of the map, suppressing any who may try to climb to face it. At the same time, due to the ability for this plane to retain its speed and therefore its energy after some exaggerated manoeuvres or in a dive and then the initial climb after the dive, this plane will be able to intercept bombers with relative ease. Although some of you may say at this point, well, the Focke-Wulf 190 D12 can do this as well. The difference here, however, is in the ability for the TA to maintain its energy and rebuild its altitude out of those dives. Whether they be sharp climbs afterwards or very gentle ones, this plane can go up to its altitude that it started at, if not higher, a lot more easily than the Focke-Wulf 190 D12 can. And this means that a TA-152 H-1 is very difficult to shake out of the higher altitude regions of the map once it has established itself, unless the player decides to fly down to lower altitudes and initiate a very extended and exaggerated boom and zoom run. As a result, by adhering to the process of staying up high, we are able to obtain 4th place on our team, and we can see that we drew away some of the attention of the enemy team during the course of this game, and at the same time we were able to knock out 2 of the enemy bombers which may have posed a threat to our ground units if not being used as gunships to knock out friendly fighters. It is at this point then we should move on to our second game for today, which highlights once again the need for altitude and obtaining the ideal role for the TA-152, but also what happens once you sacrifice this altitude and head down towards the lower portions of a given map. So for our second game, we turn to the ground strike map Alpine Meadows, and, using the same setup as before, the opening minute of the game is going to highlight how the climb rate of the TA-152 H-1 compares directly to those of its predecessors or indeed its battle rating contemporaries, whereby we are going to see, starting off at a spawn speed of 480 km an hour and an altitude of 2,500 metres, how we can get to 3,200 metres altitude in our first web burst, and at the same time maintain a speed of 410 km an hour at the end. We're going to look around and compare ourselves to the rest of our team, and we're going to note the Tempest, Focke-Wulf 190s, Spitfires and Messerschmitt 109s around us are climbing at comparable rates. Indeed, as we look across towards the enemy team as we initiate our second web stage, we can see that we are climbing with an F-82 Twin Mustang, a number of Focke-Wulf 190s which are most probably D variants, and we're just shy of a Messerschmitt 109 G variant, or it could even be a K, which is along the same line as us. It's at this point, as our speed drops into our third web stage and falls below 300 km an hour, we can see that our overall climb rate and overall handling characteristics are fading away. As a result, we have to very quickly, although rather gradually we should really say, turn away and head towards the eastern corner of the map. This allows us to evade the oncoming presence of the F-82, and we're going for our stealthy climb approach here, noticing that a good portion of our team seems to be following suit, but towards the centre of the map, or the western corner of the map, and at the same time, we are going to be going alone. Although we do have a Focke-Wulf 190 being attacked by a friendly Tempest, although the 190 soon relinquishes its efforts to come over towards us and instead dives down. This means we go unnoticed, and at the same time we can once again build up our speed and then regather our climb rate as before. Now what is interesting here is the fact that we're already onto a key theme behind the TA-152 H-1's presence on the battlefield, and that is its ability to go unnoticed, or perhaps the need for it to go unnoticed to be effective. But more so, what we should really realise here is the reliance of this plane on the team it is within, whereby so far the intentions of the enemy, and indeed our friendlies, have been absorbed towards the centre of the map and that is why we are now at an altitude of 5,400 metres and gathering our speed using our decent acceleration. Nonetheless, this is a game with jet aircraft, and so a number of jet aircraft such as MiG-9s will usually climb up towards the side of the map in order to get that altitude advantage they so desperately crave in the start of a match. And in this instance, it is a MiG-9 who had just finished off climbing and is starting to rebuild their overall speed and energy state. But the difference is here, at an altitude of 5,475 metres, the TA-152's acceleration remains the standard, and so we're already encroaching upon 490 to 500 km an hour speed, and it means we can close the distance on the MiG-9 rather rapidly, as they go down and try to avoid the head-on, seeing as they have not got the energy to bring the nose up, and they are very fragile by comparison with our own armament. And this means we can catch them as they try to fly under and knock them out for our first kill, whereby the spread of our armament when we open fire is enough to rip their wing off. Nonetheless, this is the way we deal with jets in the TA-152. We have to shut them down before they can build up their overall energy advantage. And as we carry our momentum through to attack a Messerschmitt 109 or a pair of them attacking a friendly Dornier 217, we tell the Dornier not to dive, but this is in vain, as we come just a little bit too late to interdict. Nonetheless, as the Dornier is wiped off by the Messerschmitt 109G variant, we are going to intervene here and get revenge, whereby the Messerschmitt 109 only realises our presence once we start opening fire, banks off to the left but provides us with a perfect shot, allowing us to achieve our second kill. We now begin an Immelmann once again, with another Messerschmitt 109 right below us and also an enemy Wellington diving out of the spawn. But here, as we finish off and continue through with our finished loop, we go into a gradual dive. The intent here is not to drop our altitude, but merely to intimidate those below us. We could continue to dive after the Wellington on the Messerschmitt 109, but this would sacrifice the position we have tried so hard to build up. And as we apologise unreservedly to the Dornier 217, we climb once again. And at this point we highlight how the TA-152 maintains its ability to climb very well back to the altitude it started at in a dive, if not further, something which sets this apart from its battle rating contemporaries and most notably the Focke-Wulf 90 D12, as iterated earlier. We go for a reload, and as we continue to look around, we realise that there are no enemy fighters, or indeed any jet fighters, pushing for altitude, although there is a de Havilland Vampire off in the distance which may be trying to do so. So we turn to counter the threat. And also notice an F-80C-10 shooting star gradually climbing. And so, we may now go into a dive and knock them out accordingly, whereby as we build our speed up here and drop our altitude, we can see that we maintain full control of the aircraft even at speeds in excess of 700 km an hour. And it is here we try to carry through onto an Arado 234B2. Yet the Arado decides to split S, and rather than go back towards the spawn point, we carry through at 920 km an hour. We start an approach on LA9, but they bank in towards the cliffs. And whilst we do have the controllability to get a shot onto target, what we have to consider is that this will bleed off enough speed for us to be a vulnerable threat by comparison with the rest of the enemy team when they come out of the spawn and come over the mountain. So instead we use our energy conservation in a straight line, or an approximate straight line with a few banking manoeuvres, in order to carry through, noticing the Arado once again coming along in our direction, as if they are teasing us. And unfortunately due to the blackout we cannot get a shot off until they break past us. But here, as we go into a slight downward turn, we're able to build up our speed once again. The Arado carries on, teasing not just us but some friendly fighters as well. So we begin to chase them down. And due to our ability to maintain 610 km an hour here after a number of serious banking manoeuvres, it means we can chase the Arado and they cannot get away, as their manoeuvres have cost them the energy they need to escape. We achieve a critical hit here, compromising their tail controls, or so it would seem, and we begin to loop over for the killing shot, being wary of the fact we've got a number of friendlies who also want this kill. But as we can see here, as we go back into a slight dive, we still have full control, and it means we've just picked up what will be, I believe, our fourth kill. It's at this point we are now down at lower altitudes, as our bloodthirsty pursuit of the Arado means we have sacrificed all that we have tried to achieve. And this is where the game is on the other foot, because now as our speed begins to ebb away, thanks to the air resistance down at lower altitudes, we have to consider the fact that the difficulty of regaining the altitude position. We begin by going into another gentle climb, trying to use one of the key traits of the TA-152 to get away from the 1,500 metres altitude cap we are currently at, and push up towards 5,000 once again. Although we can see here how the ability for enemy players now to have the altitude position compromises us to some extent, and we have to treat all nearby threats, roughly in say 5 km distance, as a viable threat. We notice a P-51 our Focke-Wulf 190 towards our airfield, and Only being approximately 1 kilometre below us in terms of altitude, they could climb up towards us and attack us directly from underneath. And with our speed at only 300 kilometres an hour and gradually increasing, this is not a threat that we can allow to continue, or one that cannot go ignored per se. So, the P-51 goes to attack the base and we go into a dive. We can catch the P-51 quite easily, and as we do, despite the fact they have come out of a very sharp dive themselves, they go head on with a friendly Focke-Wulf 190A and they both collide. So, we come out of our dive into a shallow climb once again, and we can see already that we are building up our altitude without too much compromise to our speed, even when we do level out and make a banking manoeuvre in the case of a Focke-Wulf 190 near our spawn. We carry on, and we're already back up to 2,400 metres altitude, so technically this is not too difficult, so long as we have the speed to climb. But the difficulty comes in the fact that we are always compromised here because our performance is against us. In terms of performance then, we can begin to consider the fact that in terms of altitude range, the TA-152 H-1 needs to be within an altitude of 4,000 metres altitude or higher, with a preference at approximately 5,500 metres altitude all the way up to 10,500 metres altitude for overall performance. Now, it's not to say that this plane handles any better at those altitudes as it does down low at given speeds, but the difference is the consistency of the control handling with altitude, whereby a number of aircraft, even the more high altitude optimised fighters, such as the Focke-Wulf 190D series, which are medium altitude, or the late Messerschmitt 109s, will start to have some difficulty in controllability at altitudes in excess of 7,000 metres. Meanwhile, the TA-152 does not experience this. Instead, it's quite the opposite. It just maintains the standard it already has. Unfortunately for us, in our small digression, we've been able to climb up to 4,000 metres altitude, and we can now go after a Dornier 217K. Breaking off to the side and then coming up from underneath onto a partial diagonal beam shot, the reasoning being in case it was an E variant and they decided to go head on with their lethal 20mm cannon. The Dornier is getting away, but we use our excessive WEP here to bring the Dornier down with our final burst, finishing off our ace in a day here, and as we look around once again, now that we have some altitude back, we can begin to reconsolidate the performance from earlier. Although we soon notice a Spitfire coming along at roughly the same altitude, although they appear to be going into a shallow dive. We look up and see another Dornier 217 up incredibly high, although this plane is going to be out of our reach for the rest of the game. Nonetheless, we carry on looking around and notice that we have the space to move and breathe, and this means we can now return to the altitudes which this plane craves. And when we talk about controllability in terms of speeds, what we have to realise, as echoed earlier, as we see a Messerschmitt 109 on the distance, is that the handling characteristics of the TA-152H1 come to life at approximately a speed of 450 km an hour. And we're going to see this as we dive after this Messerschmitt 109, now our speed has gone above 600 km an hour, whereby this G6 is able to manoeuvre reasonably well, although their control surfaces begin to lock up at these speeds, and we are able to follow after them. Although here the Messerschmitt 109 pilot is quite smart, constantly banking and changing from side to side, and we are coming on too fast. And at the same time, this is something to be wary of with the TA-152. It picks up speed incredibly fast in a dive, and perhaps one of the fastest rates, and this means that at times if you do not manage your throttle as seen there, you will overshoot accordingly or fly into the back of your chosen opponent. A mistake which is quite easy to do. But at the same time, once again with our energy conservation in hand, it means we can push away from that furball emanating in the valley, and stay clear of any oncoming threat, or potential ones such as that F-8F Bearcat. We look up and notice a Vampire, a Messerschmitt 109 and one unidentified assailant up at higher altitudes. It turns out to be a P-51 Mustang. They're all going after the SM-79, and as a result this provides us with an opportunity once again to climb. So it's at this point we have to wonder exactly the patience threshold for the TA-152. And whilst this game is not the most direct indication, and we're going to see that with the third game, we can see here how you have to be patient in order to get the most out of this aircraft. And unfortunately our patience here is not going to be rewarded, where Messerschmitt 109 directly coming towards us now, as we can see in the distance, a decreasing distance of 6 kilometres. And we believe it may be a Messerschmitt 19K4 due to their oncoming presence at such a velocity. And so we come around here, and we come on to the question of how does one deal with an enemy fighter down at lower altitudes? Well, in the case of the more manoeuvrable Messerschmitt 109 by comparison with the TA, you take the approach of going into a shallow dive, or this is a recommendation, whereby your controllability stays intact, meanwhile that of the K4 may begin to lower somewhat. And then using our roll rate to bank around, we can force the K4 to try and come after us, but at the same time miss as they open fire. It's at this point that we force the K4 to try and come up after us, but instead they decide to break off. because we either come around to them or perhaps even force an overshoot, and as a result that means we can now chase down the K4, with our ability to maintain energy and build it up in a dive, allowing us to chase the K4 rather successfully. Unfortunately here the K4 is bouncing around all over the place as their pilot is performing the gun defence manoeuvres, and so this provides some difficulty in our ability to get a shot off, and so we decide to aim underneath the target instead, trying to counteract the fact they are flying in a pattern, braking constantly from side to side, and then up and down. We get in close here and achieve a critical hit on their rudder, and as they collide head on with a friendly Focke-Wulf 190 A1, we realise that that ram has caused them to lose a lot of their speed, so they almost get a shot off on us, by a rather chance coincidence. And so instead we break up over the Messerschmitt 19K4 and then look away, as having dealt the damage to their rudder, they are technically combat ineffective, and the ram has probably knocked out some more of their tail controls, or indeed just some of their standard overall controllability. We look around and see a P-51 Mustang attacking one of our bases once again, and so we instantaneously go into the dive, reacting to the changing situation. And such awareness is vital in the TA-152 to survive down at lower altitudes, especially when you have a number of fighters around. We change onto this Messerschmitt 19G6, only clipping their tailwind but not achieving any major hits, and then we come around on this P-51. But at the same time the P-51 is banking around, and so because our turn circle is not the greatest, but it is a rather decent one, especially at speeds of 450 km an hour or more, it means we can eventually turn inside the P-51, although they are rather damaged already, and finish them off for our 6th and final kill of this game. At the same time we now break out, after that turn, having exhausted our weapon as well, to chase down a Dornier 217M. Although with a number of enemy fighters in the near vicinity, we decide just to survive to another day, as we already have one friendly fighter chasing down the Dornier and we do not want to put ourselves at risk. And with the game now over, let us take a look at the second set of post-game stats. Once again, we can see that our 6 kills enabled us to obtain 18,400 silver lions and accrete a further 1,422 research points. However, the importance of this second game is not in terms of the first half, whereby we were able to provide ourselves with the altitude and therefore the energy capabilities that the TA-152 desires. Although what is important is the fact that we were able to shut down a MiG-9 and an F-80C-10 Shooting Star by confronting them before they could get themselves into an altitude position and indeed build up their speed to become combat effective. And that is a key counter to any jet aircraft you may face in the TA-152. Once you have altitude, you have the ability to build up your speed, whether it's in a dive or in terms of level flight, and shut down the jet aircraft before they become effective. But the more important factor here is what happened when we went to lower altitudes following our dive on the Shooting Star. Yes, we maintained our controllability in a dive in excess of speeds of 900 km an hour, and indeed this controllability stays with you in excess of 1000 km an hour. But the importance here is in the fact that we had to be very hesitant and patient to try and get back up to a higher altitude position, and this was rewarded with our efforts on the Dornier 217K. And this meant by being more conservative in the second half and having to be very careful of our opponents and indeed the presences around us, we came fourth once again. Because we achieved our initial role, which the TA-152 craves, but then we always had to be on the back foot and react to the situations presented to us. And we saw that we were able to outmaneuver a Messerschmitt 19K4 by going into a dive when they desired a head-on. And whilst they did try to pursue us, we were able to use our manoeuvrability at higher speeds by comparison with their own locked-up controls in order to force them not to overshoot in this instance, but to have to break off. But, as they were at a lower altitude than us at that point, we were able to chase them down accordingly. And so we now move on to our final game, which is going to show what happens when the TA-152 H-1 is not given the position it wants, and indeed how it has to be implemented or has to react to such a situation in order to achieve an ace in a day, but at the same time to stay alive. And so as we come on to our third and final game for today, taken from the ground strike map African Canyon, we must start off with a brief discussion of the durability of the TA-152 H-1 in a further context other than the main fuselage and the wings, as discussed in the first game. Now we said that the durability of the main fuselage, especially towards the engine and the cockpit, is decent, whereby you have the armour plating in order to absorb some heavy machine gun fire, and perhaps even 1 or 2 cannon shells, especially from 20mm cannons. At the same time we said that the wings are prone to snapping off if hit with 20mm cannon shells, and at the same time we must further this by saying that the fuel tanks especially the large concentration of them in the inboard section of the wing, are prone to catching fire, whether they are hit by cannon shells or indeed heavy machine gun shells such as an M20 tracer round from an American 50 cal. And this means the TA-152 is highly flammable. But this gets a little bit worse when we consider what is stowed behind the pilot, and that is a cylindrical GM1 nitrous oxide tank. Now there is a significant amount of armour, as we discussed earlier, with 350 pounds of armour on this plane, to cover off this fuel tank at the back from heavy machine gun fire. Indeed, it is very rare that this fuel tank will be ignited by a 12.7 or a 13mm machine gun burst. However, if a 20mm cannon round or higher, and it is an incendiary caliber round, is able to hit onto the back of this fuel tank, the TA-152 is going to burst into flames very quickly. And as a result, you have to be very careful about being hit in this aircraft, especially when you're in the middle of a dogfight and someone is trying to get a shot onto your tail. Whereby if they do manage to, it is most likely this plane is going to catch on fire, and that fuel tank is going to be the death of you. And so whilst the main durability of this aircraft is alright, it is not ideal, and neither is its overall flammability. Nonetheless, with a Tempest Mark V now chasing after us, we're able to start to go into a shallow dive and build up our speed. The Tempest is faster at these altitudes by comparison with our own aircraft. However, as we go into a dive, we can now start to pick up the same amount of speed as the Tempest currently has. And as the Tempest breaks off to attack some friendlies, we can use that dive speed accordingly to come back up and attack them, whereby they're probably not expecting us to already be within 0.88 km as they dispatch a friendly Focke-Wulf on 90A. And so as the Tempest looks behind, they come around to initiate a dogfight, whereby we have probably caught them by surprise in some respects as to the fact we are able to maintain our speed in order to come back at them so quickly. And so as we come around, we use our reasonable turn circle comparable to that of the Tempest Mark V with these speeds, i.e. 500 km/h or excess, in order to ensure that we can stay behind the Tempest. Although they are making some very tight manoeuvres here, and as we can see that means we're actually going to overshoot. However, having compromised a good portion of their speed here, we're able to break up and over them, whereby we can now use our rudder and our ailerons combined in order to force the Tempest to break out into a stall. At this point, with our speed now at 220 km/h and dropping, we're on the verge of a stall ourselves, while our stall speed being approximately 185 km/h, or at least the point of initiation. We open with 2 bursts to force the Tempest to break up and out to the right, whereby having levelled out, we may now finish them off for our first kill. And so we can see here how if you go into a dive when being pursued by an enemy fighter, a number of fighters will break off from you, whether they've noticed friendly fighters in the distance which they would prefer to target and act as easy kills, or at the same time because they just cannot catch up to you in the midst of a dive, or only are able to equal your speed. This means that once they have broken off, you can very quickly, if they are unaware of your presence or indeed the capabilities of the TA, snap right back up at them and go in for a dogfight, and that has allowed us to kill on the Tempest. What is interesting, however, is that the two aircraft are rather comparable, the Tempest Mark V and the TA-152 H-1 historically, with a number of stories concerning dogfights between the two. Indeed, the Tempest is a much better performer at lower altitudes, although once the aircraft have got speed behind them, they become rather equal in some respects. Nonetheless, with our small digression out of the way, we notice the B-29 on the horizon at approximately 6,000 metres altitude, and we continue to build our altitude in a similar vein as we have done throughout all the games so far. The concept of us being suppressed by the enemy team will come around very shortly. A number of enemy fighters are currently climbing from spawn and attacking some friendly B-17s over their airfield and their bases, which means we have got time to try and dispatch this B-29, who is moving rather quickly and rather elegantly. As we climb up here, we are going to see how, despite our ability to maintain speed and climb to significant portions of altitude in a very small space of time, is not enough even against this B-29, whereby we open fire indiscriminately and clip their tail section. Unfortunately, however, it's not enough at the moment, and so we will come back to that B-29 much later on in this game, as they continue on their way and start to bomb out another base. As we go into a dive here, we try to bring our nose up, but now the enemy fighters have been spotted. One F-7F-1, a Spitfire, and perhaps even another aircraft in the distance, which is just a black dot for the time being. And so we turn away and look towards a friendly B-17, and our third assailant has just been identified as an enemy Bearcat. We also notice an enemy Spitfire climbing up from the enemy spawn, i.e. on the north side of the map, and so we have to judge our position accordingly. We look around and notice that the B-29 is going to be escorted by these enemy fighters for the time being, and there is no way we can interdict. We look down towards the Spitfire, and as we go into another dive once again, we believe they may be coming at us accordingly. Interestingly enough, they are not, and so we open fire. We clip them for a critical hit, and then we break off, as the Spitfire will be able to turn inside us so they have still got controllability in their hands. So with a critical hit in our favour, we now continue to zoom up, although we are being covered off to some respect by the Spitfire and the Tiger Cat, i.e. the F7F, whereby they are going after our friendly B-17 and they can dive down on us accordingly, as the Bearcat goes after another one of our bombers, most likely that Wellington over there, on the centre of your screen. And as we level out here and try to rebuild our altitude, we are now directly being covered off by the Spitfire, with the Spitfire and the Tiger Cat both noticing our presence here and not allowing us to push up. So this is going to be a game of cat and mouse and a lot of patience required in the time being. And the point of this game is to echo the need for patience in the TA-152 H-1, whereby we need altitude to succeed. But when we are not on a team which pushes for higher altitude to a significant degree, as depicted here, we are not going to be able to get into the role that we desire. And so it's going to be a game of waiting. And this is one of the key put-offs of flying the TA-152 H-1, from what I have gathered from the War Thunder community in general and indeed from my own experience. At the moment, when I was playing this game, I was incredibly frustrated, because I know I cannot do anything other than try to build up altitude, get closer to the Spitfire and lure them down towards friendly territory, as the Spitfire, whether it is a Griffin or a Merlin, will be able to outmaneuver me in the midst of a turn fight, and indeed the only capabilities I have against them are the ability to outdive them and outrun them on the long. But then again, to outrun the Spitfire, I need to be up at higher altitudes to be able to obtain my top speeds. Nonetheless, with Bearcat also diving down to throw a number of rockets at the base and knock it out, we had the problem here of the fact that nobody on our team was pushing up accordingly, and the enemy fighters are adamant in their defence of the B-29, or indeed just suppressing us. So it means we just have to wait, and with the Bearcat now down at lower altitudes, the pressure is starting to compile itself, whereby we have to make sure that all of our opponents are being kept track of. So very good spatial awareness will do you very well in the TA-152, because indeed this plane is prey to anyone who finds it down at lower altitudes. And this is being echoed here by the fact that we have constantly got to keep our guard on the Spitfire, and indeed the Bearcat and the Tiger Cat. Nonetheless, with this frustration comes the rewarding factor of when you do manage to get to those higher altitudes, as we have seen already in the first game and partially in the second. But in the meantime we have seen another item which we can grab, and that is a Messerschmitt 410 down at extremely low altitudes, seemingly attacking the base just below us and being allowed to do so without any harassment. That is until we have spotted them. And so we decide, instead of diving instantaneously, to continue over the top of them and then break down sharply, as we wish to echo the controllability of the TA-152 H-1 at extreme speeds, whereby the 410 is going to try and break underneath us, but we are able to turn in with them. Whilst it is a heavy fighter, such a manoeuvre is quite a defensive one, and one that works well against planes such as a Spitfire, F Mark 14, or indeed the later Griffins, due to their control surfaces not being as loose by comparison with the TAs. Nonetheless, with another kill in the bag now, we continue to look up, and we notice that our opponents up at higher altitudes are still not relinquishing their duties. And so we're going to head out towards another corner of the map and try to push upwards. This is a rather boring concept to some of you, I know, but at the same time I felt that this was crucial to feature this game in order to echo the average experience that a TA-152 will expect. And this is where we come on to the point of where this plane works incredibly well, and that is in tandem with a squad mate, whereby this plane, if given the opportunity to get up to higher altitudes thanks to a squad mate who gets there beforehand, in say an F8F-1B Bearcat, will be able to clear the way for the TA-152 to then be able to deliver the brutal damage that it can. Otherwise you're going to have to be reliant on the teammates you encounter from game to game, or indeed reliant on the fact that the enemy team will just not notice you. But anyway, taking the optimistic approach, it would seem as though the enemy fighters have now been distracted by the fact there is two B-17s and one Focke-Wulf 190 and perhaps an LA-9 off towards the friendly spawn point for the enemy team, and as a result this means we can now build up our altitude. We see a Dornier 217 off to our right, and we are gradually making our way over, although we do not want to make our intentions too direct in case it is a Dornier 217E who will go head on with us, or is most likely to thanks to their nose mounted 20mm cannon. The Dornier begins to dive, it would seem, and so we are given the opportunity here to chase after them, whereby as they go into the dive we are going to chase them and keep with them, as whilst the Dornier is fast in the dive, we are just that little bit faster. We continue to look around, trying to make the Dornier think we're not going to come after them, and as they level out, now we begin the chase, whereby we're already building our speed up above 600 km an hour, and the Dornier, whilst travelling at approximately 550 km an hour here, is not going to be able to outrun us. We continue our dive to come up underneath them and prevent them from using the seesaw motion, which is a very good defensive manoeuvre. And as a result, as we come up underneath them, we can mitigate the power of their turrets, force them to bank out to the right, and finish them off for another kill. Whereby we're free in the bag now, we look around and see that the F7F has once again come over towards friendly territory. Looking around, however, we have now sated the fact that there is one more bomber out of the skies, and it would seem as though the enemy team or the enemy fighters are finally being dispatched, either via overconfidence into the friendly territory here, or by the fact that their attention has been drawn elsewhere. We notice the B-29 is unguarded, although there is an enemy Lancaster just coming out of the spawn point, and it is being untouched. So we have to react accordingly, once again using this plane in the interceptor role, which it is highly designated for, in order to ensure that the enemy bomb payloads do not make it to our airfield, or indeed our bases, whereby the B-29 is going to be the only bomber allowed to do so for the time being. The Lancaster glides along, and we just come up underneath, once again applying the fact that we are able to build up our altitude and continue to build it for a lot longer than by comparison of our battle rating contemporaries. And having already set the Lancaster on fire, it is only time before that is number 4. And our patience is now being rewarded to some extent, as the enemy fighters have finally been dispatched. It has taken approximately 10 minutes for this to occur, but at the same time it means we've just picked up our 4th kill, and we can now continue our pursuit of the B-29. There is an enemy Spitfire coming over, but they are going after the B-17 on our team, and this provides us with the opportunity to finally dispatch the B-29 from the game. It means now that at 4,300 metres altitude and rising, we can use our engine, our Yonkojima, to full extent, and we have no hesitation here of what our direct target is and the fact that we have no threat after us. And so, with this patience now in hand and having been rewarded, we can look back and say that our survivability relies on us on being patient and at the same time aware of those who are above us, whereby if an enemy fighter is able to get above us all the way up to an altitude of approximately 6,000 metres, we will not have the performance to outwit them unless we can force them into a series of overshoot yo-yo manoeuvres. And so we use the same approach on the B-29 as before, but this time we've got the energy to dispatch them and finally get rid of them, setting the left wing on fire and finally getting our 5th kill and the ace in the day. It took us a while, but it was well worth it in the end. And now, the game has finally concluded. So let us take a look at our 3rd and final set of post-game stats. And so with our 5 kills providing us with an additional 10,898 silver lines and 1,218 research points for our work on the Ho 229V3, we must consider this 3rd game as a valid demonstration of the average game that the TA-152 H-1 will experience, whereby we are reliant on our team in all portions in order to distract our opponents from the higher altitude regions of the map, as if we are up against an enemy team that decides to prioritise altitude over direct confrontation. The TA-152 will be at their submission, whereby we are not able to take to the higher altitude portions of the map effectively and dispatch the bombers or indeed harass the enemy fighters that are trying to do so as well. So we have to play the patient game, and we have to have a very deep pool, in fact an unlimited pool of patience and calm aura, in order to wait, bide our time and eventually strike at the heart of the enemy bombers or enemy fighters that have dived down, as shown here where we were able to intercept finally a Dornier 217, an ignored Lancaster and the B-29 that we took an initial run on and then had to sacrifice a lot of time in setting up our 2nd and conclusive run. As a result, the TA-152 is incredibly reliant on its team in order to pull away the enemy fighters that may contend with it, or indeed this works very well in a squad, whereby if the initial squad members are able to clear the higher altitude portions of the map for the TA-152 to fulfill, the plane is going to be incredibly effective at providing a high altitude support role. Nonetheless, to beat the TA-152, one has to consider the fact that when we were engaged by the Messerschmitt 19K4 and indeed the Tempest Mark V, with the Messerschmitt 19 being in the 2nd game, not the 3rd game here, you have to be relentless in your pursuit of it. If it decides to dive back to friendly territory, let it go, because it is going to be very difficult to catch up to the TA-152 in a dive. But at the same time, do not take your eyes off of it, because as we saw against the Tempest, a TA-152 pilot can snap around and go back for an engagement just as quickly as they can break off of it. You need to stay behind it therefore, manoeuvre behind it and ensure to use sharp manoeuvres to cut your speed accordingly behind it, and finally, once its speed drops below 300 km an hour, it will be a sitting duck for you to kill, thanks to its questionable durability and high flammability. Nonetheless, we managed to obtain 3rd place by comparison to the rest of our team thanks to our patience and our emphasis on being able to get to higher altitude regions and intercept the enemy bombers, and perhaps even take on the Tempest and the Messerschmitt 410 when and where appropriate. And as a result, this emphasises that the TA-152 H-1 in my opinion does have a valid place in War Thunder's arcade mode, a question which is thrown at me time and time again. The place of the TA-152 is the support fighter. It works very well if given the opportunity to get to the higher altitude regions of the map. The reasoning is because once it is instated at 4,000 metres altitude as a minimum, but ideally 6,000 metres or more, it is able to chase down the bombers which are usually out of the grasp of most fighters, such as the G-8N or indeed some of the B-17s and the B-29. And with this fighter in the skies, one can assure everyone else on the team that no bomber or indeed any high altitude fighter is going to survive for very long. Because once this fine lady unveils her very long wings, she identifies herself as the Angel of Death. And so I've been TX141, and if you enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future War Thunder videos on my channel. I apologise for the lack of uploads in recent days ladies and gentlemen, but unfortunately I've been working on this review for the last 2 weeks. It has taken me an incredibly long time to put this all together, and hopefully, just hopefully, it has been rewarding and worth it in your eyes. But as always, take care, and good luck in the skies!